Frederick Talbot had not set foot inside a social gathering in 4 years, and every soul in Harrow Creek, Texas, knew better than to ask him why. The year was 1883, and Harrow Creek sat like a determined little fist pressed against the edge of the Llano Estacado, that vast flat tableland that stretched west into nothing but sky and red dirt. It was a cattle town, a working town, the kind of place where men woke before the sun and went to bed after it, where the smell of horses and leather and cook fire smoke was so constant it stopped being a smell at all and became just the ordinary texture of breathing. The town had a general store run by old Morris Hepp, a barber shop, a jail that mostly sat empty, a church with a bell that never rang on time, a saloon called the Copper Spur, and a community hall that had been built 3 years prior by collective volunteer labor and a great deal of donated whiskey. That community hall was where the socials happened. Square dances, harvest suppers, Christmas celebrations, spring flings with fiddle music and cider, and the kind of laughter that floated out through the windows and drifted across the dark prairie like something warm let loose into the cold. People came from ranches 10 miles out dressed in their best, faces scrubbed, boots polished, children running between adult legs like small unguided projectiles. It was the heartbeat of Harrow Creek's social life, and Frederick Talbot had not attended a single one. He was 29 years old, lean and hard-worked, with hands so callous they could have gripped a branding iron without much complaint. He stood a few inches over 6 feet, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck when it got long, which was most of the time because he did not visit the barber shop with any regularity. His eyes were a complicated shade of gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they tended to observe things from a particular still distance, the way a man watches a fire from across the yard rather than standing close enough to feel its warmth. He was not unfriendly. He was just deliberately separate, in the way that a person learns to be when they have decided that keeping their own company is safer than risking the company of others. He ran the Talbot Ranch 4 miles north of town, which had been his father's ranch and his grandfather's before that. It was a modest operation, 200 acres of decent grassland, a herd of about 60 cattle, 3 horses he trusted absolutely, and a bunkhouse that had housed anywhere from 2 to 6 ranch hands depending on the season. He was respected in town. When he came in for supplies, people greeted him warmly. He tipped his hat, answered questions directly, paid his debts on time. But when someone mentioned the upcoming harvest social or the Christmas dance, Frederick Talbot would give a small nod that conveyed nothing in particular, and the conversation would shift, because everyone had learned that pressing the matter produced no results. The story behind his absence was known, because this was a small town and small towns do not permit privacy with any particular generosity. 4 years ago, during the spring social of 1879, Frederick had been a different man. He had been 25 then, engaged to a woman named Clara Hensley, who had come to Harrow Creek from San Antonio with her family when she was 19. Clara was bright and full of laughter, and she had loved the socials with the particular passion of someone who finds their truest self in the company of others. Frederick had gone to every single one with her, had learned to dance badly and without much shame, had stood in the corner holding 2 glasses of cider, and watching her spin and glow in the lantern light, with an expression that even the most casual observer could read as pure and uncomplicated adoration. Clara Hensley had died of fever in the summer of 1879, 3 months before they were to be married. She was 21 years old. The fever had moved through the county that summer like a quiet disaster, taking 3 children and 2 adults in the space of 6 weeks. Clara had been the last to go. Frederick had sat at her bedside for 8 days, holding her hand and talking to her about the ranch and the horses and the future they were going to build together, and on the 9th morning she had simply stopped breathing between one moment and the next, as though she had just decided to rest and never found her way back. He had not gone to a social sense, not because he had made a dramatic decision about it, not because he had sworn some kind of oath, but because the community hall with its fiddle music and its lantern light and its cider was too precisely the shape of the life he had expected to have, and walking into it without her felt like trying to climb into a suit of clothes that had been made for a different version of himself. He had learned to be fine with his solitude. He had learned to make it work. The ranch kept him busy and the work was real and satisfying, and there was a particular peace in the rhythm of a ranching life, the morning chores, the afternoon riding, the evening accounting and mending, and the steady company of animals that did not ask anything complicated of you. He was fine. He had been fine for 4 years. And then Elsie Garrison arrived in Harrow Creek on a Thursday in early October of 1883, and everything that had been carefully arranged in the interior of Frederick Talbot began, slowly and without his permission, to rearrange itself. Elsie Garrison was 24 years old, and she arrived in a wagon with 3 trunks, a canvas bag of books, a small iron pot she claimed was essential and non-negotiable, and an expression on her face that suggested she was the kind of person who had made deliberate choices and intended to stand by them even when they were difficult. She had taken the position of schoolteacher for the Harrow Creek School, which had been without a qualified teacher for nearly 8 months following the departure of the previous teacher, a Mr. Aldous Birch, who had left rather abruptly after a disagreement with 3 different sets of parents about the proper approach to arithmetic education. She had come from Abilene, where she had taught for 2 years in a school there, and before that she had grown up in Missouri in a household with a father who believed strongly in education for daughters as well as sons, which was not the prevailing sentiment of the era, but was a hill he had chosen to die on regardless. Her mother had died when Elsie was 14, and she had raised her 2 younger brothers alongside her father for the remainder of her adolescence, which had given her a particular practical confidence that did not resemble bossiness so much as a calm certainty that things needed doing and that she was capable of doing them. She was not the kind of beautiful that announced itself. She had a practical face, which is to say a face that was genuinely lovely but not in any theatrical way, with warm brown eyes that were direct and attentive, a mouth that seemed always on the verge of either saying something honest or smiling at something she found quietly amusing, and dark hair that she wore pinned up, but that had a persistent tendency to escape in strands around her face and neck. She was of average height, with the kind of uprightness in her posture that suggested someone who had been told to stand straight and had actually internalized the advice rather than just performing it. She had come with purpose and intention. The schoolhouse was a single room on the eastern edge of town, somewhat the worse for its 8 months of vacancy, and one of the first things Elsie did after dropping her trunks at the boarding house run by Mrs. Dora Hadley was to go directly to the schoolhouse, open the windows, assess the situation, and begin making a list. It was this quality, the list-making, the assessment, the immediate and unsentimentally practical engagement with whatever was in front of her, that people in Harrow Creek would come to admire about her very quickly. She did not complain. She simply looked at the problem and then began working on it. Mrs. Hadley, who ran the boarding house and therefore knew everything about everyone because people are inclined to talk when they are comfortable and well-fed, was the first to befriend Elsie genuinely. She was a stout woman in her 60s with an enormous heart and an extremely limited filter between her thoughts and her mouth, which meant conversations with her were informative and sometimes slightly alarming. "You will want to know about the people here," Mrs. Hadley told Elsie on her first evening, setting a plate of cornbread and stew in front of her. "Most of them are good. Some of them are difficult. The Jepson boys are difficult. Don't let them convince you that they know more mathematics than you do because they will try." "I appreciate the warning," Elsie said, and she meant it. And there's Frederick Talbot out on the North Ranch, Mrs. Hadley continued, in the particular tone of someone arriving at the subject they had intended to arrive at all along. He does not come to socials, hasn't in 4 years. His betrothed died. You should know so you don't say the wrong thing. Elsie was quiet for a moment. What was she like? Mrs. Hadley seemed surprised to be asked that question rather than one about Frederick. Clara? Oh, she was a sweet girl, very alive if you know what I mean. The kind of person who fills up a room without trying. It hit him terribly hard. She paused, studying her own hands. He's not unfriendly, he just keeps himself apart. That's his right, Elsie said simply and went back to her stew. She encountered Frederick Talbot for the first time 4 days after her arrival in Morris Hep's general store, where she had gone to purchase chalk and a new slate board and various other supplies for the schoolroom. He came in as she was negotiating with old Morris over the price of a set of arithmetic primers, which Morris was charging for at a rate she considered excessive given their condition. Frederick Talbot walked in behind her, and she was aware of him in the peripheral way you are aware of someone large entering a small space, a slight shift in the air, a new presence. She did not pay him particular attention because she was in the middle of making her case to Morris, who was beginning to show signs of capitulating, and she had learned that in negotiations the worst thing you can do is lose focus at the moment of victory. Mr. Hep, she was saying, her voice patient and clear, these primers have been used by at least 2 generations of students. The bindings are weak, and 3 of the pages in the 2nd volume are water-stained to the point of illegibility. I am not suggesting they are worthless. I am suggesting that their worth is not what you have priced them at. Morris Hep scratched his ear. Miss Garrison, I ordered those primers special. From whom, may I ask? The catalog. The Sears catalog, I would imagine, which means you paid a certain amount for them, added your markup, and then they sat in your storeroom for quite some time before their condition declined. I will give you what you paid for them plus 10%. That seems fair to both of us. Morris Hep looked at Frederick Talbot, who had come to lean against the far counter, apparently finding the negotiation mildly entertaining. Morris looked back at Elsie. He said, "All right, Miss Garrison," in the tone of a man who has decided it is easier to surrender than to continue arguing with someone who knows what they want. Frederick Talbot, after Morris had wrapped the primers and Elsie had paid, said from his position against the far counter, "That was well handled." She turned to look at him properly for the first time. The gray-green eyes, the sun-weathered face, the particular stillness he carried around him like a second coat. She said, "Thank you." "Were you hoping to witness a failure?" The corner of his mouth moved in something that might, in favorable light, be called a smile. "No, I was just noting a success." She held his gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary, taking his measure the way people do when they are trying to decide what kind of person they are dealing with. Then she picked up her bundle of primers and said, "Good afternoon," and walked out. He watched the door close behind her and then stood there for a moment in the store, thinking about nothing in particular that he could have named. The school opened the following Monday with 14 students ranging from 6 to 15 years of age, including, as Mrs. Hadley had predicted, the 3 Jepson boys, who arrived with the specific energy of people who had been told to behave, and had decided to interpret that instruction very loosely. Elsie handled them with a combination of absolute firmness and genuine interest in what they actually knew, which turned out to be a more effective approach than the authoritarian methods of the departed Mr. Birch. By the end of the first week, the Jepson boys were not exactly model students, but they were, at least, attending. The school day ended at 3 in the afternoon, and Elsie had the habit of taking a walk in the early evening before supper, because she had found that her mind worked better if she gave it time outdoors after a day of concentrated indoor work. The town of Harrow Creek was small enough that her walks sometimes took her to its edges, where the dirt road out to the various ranches began and the buildings stopped, and the prairie simply started, enormous and open, and in the October evenings, a particular shade of gold that she found both beautiful and slightly overwhelming in its scale. It was on one of these evening walks, about 2 weeks after her arrival, that she encountered Frederick Talbot again, and under circumstances that were considerably less controlled than a general store negotiation. She had walked a little farther than usual, out to the edge of the Mallory Creek, a narrow band of water about half a mile from the town's eastern boundary, where a small stand of cottonwood trees grew, and the light did something interesting in the late afternoon. She was standing on the bank watching the water, not doing anything in particular, just being still for a moment, when she heard the sound of a horse and looked up to see Frederick Talbot coming along the track from the direction of town, riding a black horse with the kind of easy, unhurried authority of a man who has spent a significant portion of his life on horseback. He saw her and slowed, which was courteous, because a horse coming at speed on a narrow track near someone standing on a bank was not ideal. He brought the horse to a walk and then stopped a few yards away. "Miss Garrison," he said. "Mr. Talbot," she said. She had learned his name from Mrs. Hadley, as she had learned most names in town. "This is a fair walk from town," he observed, not critically, just as a statement of fact. "I know," she said. "I like the cottonwoods." He looked at the cottonwoods as if considering them afresh from this perspective. "They're good trees," he allowed. There was a pause. The horse shifted its weight. The creek moved over its stones with its small perpetual sound. "Your horse is beautiful," she said. He looked at the horse and then back at her with a slight surprise, as though he had not expected that particular observation. "Her name is Ink. She's 9 years old. Is she yours, or does she belong to the ranch?" "Mine," he said, and there was something simple and definite in the way he said it that was not possessiveness so much as a specific and quiet pride. "Does she have opinions?" Elsie asked. He blinked. "Opinions? Horses do," she said. "My father had an old mare who had very strong opinions about which direction she preferred to travel, and she made them known." The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost smile. "Ink has opinions about starting work before she considers herself properly awake. She also has opinions about chickens." "What are her opinions about chickens?" "Primarily that they are unreasonable and should not exist." Elsie laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and it seemed to catch Frederick Talbot slightly off guard, as though the sound of it was something he had not been prepared for. He looked at her for a moment with that still gray-green gaze, and then he said, "I should get on. I have fencing to check before dark." "Of course," she said. "Good evening, Mr. Talbot." "Good evening, Miss Garrison." He rode on, and she watched him go, and then she turned back to the cottonwoods and stood there for a while longer, thinking that he was a more interesting person than his reputation as a solitary man might have suggested. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of life in Harrow Creek settled around Elsie in a way that felt increasingly like home, which surprised her because she had not expected to feel at home here so quickly. She was not a person who had difficulty in new places, but the particular texture of Harrow Creek, the genuineness of it, the way the people were direct and warm and willing to be helpful in practical ways, felt comfortable in a way she appreciated. She saw Frederick Talbot occasionally, in the way that people see each other in a small town where everyone moves through the same limited geography. At the general store, on the road between town and the school. Once at the church on a Sunday when he came in late and sat at the back and left before the closing hymn was entirely finished, not rudely, but in the manner of someone fulfilling an obligation carefully and then returning to their preferred solitude. She did not seek him out. She was not, by nature, a pursuing sort of person. She was the kind of person who noticed things and let them develop or not develop at whatever pace was natural to them. But she noticed that his solitude was not the solitude of a man who wanted to be alone so much as the solitude of a man who had decided that wanting company was a vulnerability he could not afford. The harvest social was announced in late October. A notice posted on the board outside the general store, handwritten by Mrs. Pauline Mercer, who organized such things with enormous energy and zero tolerance for insufficient participation. It was to be held on the first Saturday of November, which gave people 2 weeks to prepare, which in Harrow Creek terms meant that the women would spend 2 weeks baking and discussing what to wear, and the men would spend 2 weeks pretending they didn't care and then showing up in clean shirts. Elsie intended to go. She had always loved such events, the community of them, the shared pleasure of people gathering not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She helped Mrs. Hadley bake 2 apple pies for the occasion, a project that took an entire Thursday evening and resulted in what she considered to be 2 of the finer pies she had produced in recent memory. The morning before the social, she was cleaning the blackboard in the schoolhouse when she heard a knock at the open door and looked up to find a small girl standing in the doorway. She was perhaps 7, with 2 dark braids and a serious expression. She was one of Elsie's students, Molly Dunbar, whose family ran the feed store. "Miss Garrison," Molly said, "my ma wants to know if you need help carrying your pies to the social tomorrow." "That's very kind of her," Elsie said. "Tell her I would appreciate the company." Molly did not leave. She stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had additional business to conduct. "Is there something else, Molly? Is it true that Mr. Talbot doesn't ever come to the socials?" Molly asked. Elsie set down her eraser. "I believe so. Why not?" "Sometimes people have reasons that are private," Elsie said, which was as honest an answer as she felt she could give to a 7-year-old. "My pa says he used to be friendly before his lady died," Molly said, in the way children relay adult conversations without the filters that adults apply. "People change when they lose someone they love," Elsie said. "That's natural." "Does it unchange?" Molly asked. Elsie thought about this seriously. "Sometimes," she said, "when they're ready." The day of the harvest social was clear and cold, the kind of October day in Texas that is honest about the coming winter without being cruel about it yet. The sky was a deep, uninterrupted blue, and the air smelled like dried grass and wood smoke. And by the time the lanterns in the community hall were lit and the fiddles were tuned, the whole town had the atmosphere of a collective exhale, a deliberate decision to enjoy something together after the hard work of the growing season. Elsie arrived with Mrs. Hadley and the 2 pies, and was immediately absorbed into the warm noise of the hall, which smelled of fresh-baked bread and spilled cider and sawdust from the clean floor. She knew most of the people there now, had formed opinions about them, and allowed them to form opinions about her, and the greetings she received were warm and genuine. She set the pies on the long table at the back and accepted a cup of cider from Mr. Dunbar, Molly's father, who was a large, quiet man with a genuine smile. The fiddle music started and the dancing began, and Elsie danced with Mr. Hepp's youngest son, James, who was 19 and enthusiastic if somewhat approximate in his steps, and then with the school board chairman, a Mr. Robert Caldwell, who was a good dancer and very proud of it. She was enjoying herself thoroughly, which was her natural state in such gatherings, when she became aware of a small disturbance near the door. It was not a dramatic disturbance. It was the kind that only people paying attention would have noticed, which was a change in the angle of several people's gazes toward the door, and a brief interruption in the usual patterns of conversation, and then a quick resumption of everything as though nothing of particular note had occurred. But something of note had occurred. Frederick Talbot was standing in the doorway of the community hall. He was wearing a clean dark coat and a shirt that was not his everyday work shirt, and he had been to the barber shop. She could tell, because his hair was cut at the back and his face was freshly shaved. He stood very still in the doorway, and his expression was the expression of a man who has made a decision he is committed to and is now having to actually carry it out, which is a different thing from making the decision and more difficult. He looked around the hall with those gray-green eyes, moving carefully from one cluster of people to another as though taking inventory, and then he found Elsie. She did not look away. She held his gaze and gave a small, genuine smile the kind that was not performance but simply recognition. He walked in. He accepted a cup of cider from Mrs. Pauline Mercer, who handed it to him with an expression so carefully controlled in its excitement that it was obvious she wanted to say approximately 17 things about the fact that he was there, and was restraining herself heroically. She said only, "Frederick, lovely to see you," which was a masterpiece of restraint. Several men came to greet him, the kind of easy masculine greeting that involved handshakes and brief sentences about cattle and weather, and he responded in his usual direct way, and he stood with them for a while and drank his cider and watched the dancing. He did not dance. He was not there yet. But he was there, and that was a thing nobody in Harrow Creek had expected to see, and the hall had absorbed it with a characteristic warmth that avoided making him feel like a spectacle. Elsie did not go to him. She continued doing what she had been doing, talking with Mrs. Hadley and helping organize the pie distribution when that time came, and dancing another round with the Dunbar boy and with the minister's husband, a small cheerful man named Herbert who turned out to be an excellent dancer. But she was aware of Frederick Talbot in the room the way you are aware of weather, a particular quality in the atmosphere that registers even when you are looking elsewhere. After the pie was distributed and the music had shifted to a slower song, she found herself standing near the back wall with a fresh cup of cider, and he came to stand near her, not quite beside her, but close enough that when he spoke it was clearly to her and not to the room. "Miss Garrison," he said. "Mr. Talbot," she said. "I did not expect to see you here." "No," he said, looking out at the dancing. "I didn't expect to be here." She waited because he had something further to say and she could feel it. "I had intended to come 4 years ago," he said quietly, "and then I didn't, and then I made a habit of not, and habits can be harder to break than bad intentions. Or easier to mistake for principles." She considered this. "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not entirely certain," he said, which was honest enough that she believed him. They stood together and watched the dancers, and the fiddle played something that the dancers seemed to know by heart, moving through it with the ease of long familiarity. The hall was warm with bodies and laughter and the good smell of food and celebration, and Frederick Talbot stood in the middle of it for the first time in 4 years, not entirely at ease but not fleeing either, which was something. "You didn't dance," she said. "I never was much of a dancer," he said. "That is what people say when they don't want to be embarrassed," she said, "and also sometimes what people say when it's actually true. I can never tell which one without evidence." "Which is why you're asking me to dance," he said, and it was framed as a statement because he had realized it before she had fully decided herself. "I'm noting the absence of evidence," she said. "That's the same thing," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, something quieter and more open than his usual tone, as though the social was doing its work on him after all. He set his cider cup down on the edge of the table and held out his hand. "Then I suppose we should produce some evidence." She took his hand. He was not a good dancer. He had said so, and it was true. But he was earnest about it, which was better than competence in certain respects, because there is something more appealing about a person trying seriously at something they are bad at than a person performing expertise they have already mastered. He held her properly, his hand at her waist with a deliberate respectfulness, and he counted the steps under his breath with a very slight movement of his lips that she could feel more than hear, and he stood on her foot twice, which she absorbed without comment. When the song ended, they separated with the particular awkwardness of people who have been doing something together and are suddenly doing nothing together, and the air between them felt different, charged with something small but real. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "You're not as bad as you claimed. I stood on your foot twice." "Only twice," she said, and she smiled. And he looked at her smile with an expression she could not entirely read but which seemed to contain a kind of surprise, as though he had not expected to feel whatever it was he was feeling. He left before the social was entirely over, Around 9 o'clock, when the dancing had been going for a few hours and people were beginning to wind down, but he left graciously, saying goodbye to several people on his way out. And when he tipped his hat at Elsie on his way through the door, she nodded back and watched him go with a feeling she chose not to examine too closely just yet. Mrs. Hadley, who had seen everything and forgotten nothing, appeared at Elsie's elbow the moment the door had closed behind Frederick. "Well," she said, "that is the first time in 4 years that man has been in this hall." "So I understand," Elsie said. "He danced with you," Mrs. Hadley said. "Once," Elsie said. "He did not dance with Clara at the last social he attended," Mrs. Hadley said, which was a statement with implications so substantial that she left it sitting there without adding to it. Elsie took a sip of her cider and looked at the door through which Frederick Talbot had just departed. She felt something that she could not name precisely, something that was not yet hope but was in the same family as hope, a possibility that had not been there before and was now there quietly, without announcement. The following Saturday there was no organized social, but there was a smaller gathering at the church for a fundraising effort for the repair of the bell tower, which involved a modest pot of coffee, an assortment of donated baked goods, and a conversation that lasted approximately 3 hours and covered the bell tower for perhaps 40 minutes of it and every other subject of local concern for the remainder. Elsie went because she considered it part of her role in the community to be present and engaged, and because she genuinely liked several of the people who would be there. Frederick Talbot came. It was not a social in the formal sense, but it was a gathering, and he came, and he stood near the coffee and spoke with Robert Caldwell about the state of the county road and with Morris Hepp about the price of fence wire and with Elsie, when she drifted his way, about a book she was using with her older students that he had apparently read, which surprised her. "You've read Thoreau?" she asked, because she had not expected it and was not going to pretend otherwise. "My father had a decent library," he said, "more than you'd expect for a ranch in West Texas. He believed books were necessary." "He was right," she said. "What did you think of it?" "I thought it was the work of a man who understood something true about the value of simplicity and who overstated his case a little bit," he said, "which is what people who understand true things often do." She stared at him for a moment. "That is an extremely precise criticism," she said. "Am I wrong?" "No," she said. "You are not wrong." He looked at her with that particular stillness and then said, "What are you teaching them from it?" And they talked for 40 minutes about Thoreau and about education, and about what she believed children should be taught versus what they were usually taught, and he had opinions about all of it, quiet and specific opinions that he offered without aggression, but also without apology, and she found the conversation exhilarating in the way that conversations with a genuinely engaged mind always were. She had not had many of those since leaving Abilene, and she had missed them more than she had acknowledged to herself. When she returned to the boarding house that evening, Mrs. Hadley did not say a word about Frederick Talbot. She simply poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of Elsie with the particular expression of a woman who knows something and is enjoying the knowledge privately. "You're being conspicuously restrained," Elsie told her. "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Hadley said, and poured her own tea. The 3rd time was the Christmas social in December. This one was the grandest of the year, held with more elaborate decoration. A proper Christmas tree brought in by Mr. Dunbar and decorated by his children with paper ornaments and dried berries. And the fiddle music was joined by a man with a guitar who had come from Abilene and played with genuine skill. The hall was lit by more lanterns than usual, and the effect was something approaching beautiful, warm and golden, and full of the particular gaiety of people who have been working hard for a long time and have decided, collectively, to stop for one night. Frederick Talbot arrived 20 minutes after the start. He was expected now, which was a different thing from being expected before, because it meant the community had absorbed his returning presence and adjusted its understanding of who he was accordingly. Mrs. Mercer, who had been heroically restrained at the harvest social, allowed herself a full smile at the Christmas one and said, "Frederick, I'm so glad," which was true and which he accepted with a small nod, and what was becoming, with Elsie's increasing familiarity, a recognizable almost smile. He found her deliberately this time. She was helping Mrs. Hadley arrange cups on the table near the cider barrel, and he came to where she was and said, "Miss Garrison," and she turned and said, "Mr. Talbot," and they looked at each other with the recognition of two people who have had a conversation about Thoreau that lasted 40 minutes and know something about each other because of it. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "You did not say that, didn't I?" He seemed to think about it. "I thought it. Thinking something is not the same as saying it." "I'm saying it now," he said, "for future reference." She smiled at him, and he took the cup of cider she offered and stood beside her while she finished organizing the table, and then they walked together to the edge of the dancing floor and watched the dancers move through a reel, and she did not reach for him and he did not reach for her, but they stood close enough that the sleeves of their coats were almost touching, and there was a warmth in that proximity that neither of them commented on directly. "Are you going home for Christmas?" she asked. "I am home," he said. "The ranch is home. No family, brothers, sisters. A sister in San Antonio. She married well and has a good life. We write." He paused. "You?" "My father and brothers in Missouri. I'll write them a long letter for Christmas. My father prefers letters to anything else. He says they are more honest than conversation because you have time to think before you speak." "He sounds like a sensible man," Frederick said. "He is. He's also stubborn to an almost architectural degree. But yes, sensible." She looked sideways at him. "You would probably get along with him." "Because I'm stubborn," he said. "Because you're both people who mean what they say when they say it," she said simply. And he went quiet in the way he did when something had landed more accurately than he had expected. Later that night he asked her to dance again, and this time he stood on her foot only once, and she could tell he had been practicing somewhere in the privacy of his barn or bunkhouse, because his timing was better, and she found this, the secret quiet effort of it, unexpectedly touching. After the song she did not step back quite as far as she might have, and he did not step forward, but the space between them felt different than it had. "The New Year social," she said, looking up at him, "is in 3 weeks. "I know," he said. "Will you come?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. She looked at him for a moment, this deliberate, quiet man who had spent 4 years building walls against exactly this kind of warmth, and found herself thinking that there was something extraordinary in the particular courage of a person who chooses to feel things again after having been destroyed by feeling them before. It was not romantic courage in the dramatic sense. It was quieter than that, and more real, and she had more respect for it than she could currently find the words to express. "Good," she said, "and let that be enough for now." The New Year social came with a cold that had settled over the Llano Estacado like a lid pressed down on the world, and people drove in from the outlying ranches, with their breath making small clouds in the frozen air, and their boots crunching on the hardened ground. The community hall was heated by 2 cast iron stoves that roared with purpose, and by the time the gathering was well underway, the inside temperature was warm enough that several people had removed their coats, which in the January of 1884 in West Texas was a significant achievement. Frederick arrived early this time. Not dramatically early, not first, but before the social had properly started, when people were still setting up the tables and tuning the fiddle and arguing in friendly terms about the arrangement of the chairs. He came in and immediately made himself useful, which Elsie observed from across the room with something approaching tenderness, because she could see that he was doing it deliberately, integrating himself into the occasion rather than arriving into it as a spectator. He helped Robert Caldwell move 2 of the heavy tables that needed repositioning. He brought in 2 more loads of wood for the stoves without being asked, and then he found Elsie, who was helping Mrs. Mercer arrange the decorations at the far end of the hall and said, What needs doing over here? Mrs. Mercer has very specific opinions about where the paper garland should go, Elsie told him. I would consult her directly before touching anything. He turned to Mrs. Mercer and said, "Tell me where you want them." And Mrs. Pauline Mercer looked at him for a moment with an expression of such genuine delight at being asked for her expertise that she forgot to be flustered by him, and simply told him where to hang the garlands, which he did with the methodical and thorough approach he appeared to bring to everything. Afterward, when the room was ready and people were beginning to arrive in earnest, he and Elsie stood together near one of the windows and watched the hall fill up, and she said, "You're better at this than you thought. At hanging garlands. At being here," she said. "Among people, I think you forgot that you were good at it." He was quiet for a moment. Through the window behind him, the dark Texas night pressed close against the glass. "I didn't think I was," he said honestly. "You were always capable of it," she said. "You were just afraid." "That's a blunt thing to say." "I know," she said. "I'm a blunt person." "I know," he said, and there was something different in his tone when he said it, something that was not complaint but was closer to gratitude, and she felt her heart do a small and involuntary thing that she noted with interest. That night he danced with her 3 times. The third dance was slow enough that the space between them closed to something that was respectful but also undeniably close, and he was not counting under his breath anymore. His hand at her waist was steady and warm, and she could feel his attention on her with the full and particular quality of someone who is not dividing their focus between the present moment and anything else, and she let herself be there, entirely in the present moment too, which was a gift she did not give herself carelessly. When the music stopped and they stepped apart, he did not let go of her hand immediately. He held it for just a moment longer, his thumb moving very slightly across her knuckles, and then released it with a care that was almost formal. "Miss Garrison," he said quietly. "Yes." He seemed to be arranging something, working through something. "I wonder," he said, with the deliberateness of a man choosing his words from a limited and precious supply, "if you would allow me to call on you at the boarding house. Not in any formal sense, just," he stopped, "to talk, as we have been talking." The hall moved around them, music and laughter and the warm smell of the stoves, and she looked at him and felt very clearly that this was a man who did not ask things lightly, who had weighed this particular question against his own fear and against his own judgment and had decided to ask it anyway, and the courage in that was not small. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded, with the particular nod of a man who has been holding his breath and has just remembered how to exhale. He came on Tuesday evening. He arrived at 6, which was the time Mrs. Hadley served supper, and Mrs. Hadley, with magnificent and transparent timing, had also set a third place at the table, claiming with a completely straight face that she had intended to invite him all along. Frederick accepted this fiction with the grace of a man who appreciated its purpose and chose not to examine it too closely. Supper at Mrs. Hadley's table was a good meal, a proper stew and fresh bread and preserved peaches from the cellar, and the conversation moved easily between the 3 of them, between local news and practical matters, and then, inevitably, into the territory of ideas and books and opinions, which was where Frederick and Elsie were most naturally at home together. Mrs. Hadley, who had contributed actively for the first 40 minutes, gradually fell quiet in a strategic way, and eventually excused herself to attend to something in the kitchen that no one inquired about too closely, and Frederick and Elsie were left at the table with the remains of supper and the lamp burning warm between them. He looked at her across the table. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not been to a social in 4 years," he said. "You know why. I am not going to explain it again because you already know it, and I think if I explain it I will make it into something different than it was, which was simply that I loved someone and she died, and I did not know what to do with the space that left." He was looking at the lamp flame rather than at her, but she could feel the weight of what he was saying. I want you to know that going to the social, that first one in October, I went because I had been thinking about you for 3 weeks and I wanted to see if you were actually as." He stopped, searched for the word. "As present as you seemed to be. When we spoke." She was very still. "And am I?" "More," he said, and looked at her then directly with those gray-green eyes that carried everything he had been through and everything he was trying to move towards simultaneously. "You are more present than I expected. You are more everything, and I'm not very practiced at this. I haven't," he exhaled. "I want to be honest with you because you are an honest person and I think anything less would be a discourtesy. I am." He pressed his lips together. "I am very much interested in you, Elsie. In knowing you. In whatever might come from knowing you." She had been leaning forward slightly without noticing, drawn in by the gravity of his sincerity, and now she straightened and looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing the small, involuntary thing again, but this time she let it. "Frederick," she said, using his first name for the first time, and saw the slight change in his expression at the sound of it. "I came to Harrow Creek to teach school. I did not come looking for anything else. But I have spent 2 months having conversations with you that I find more engaging than almost any I have had in recent memory, and you have started going to socials again, which I understand to be a more significant event than it appears, and I am." She smiled quietly. "I am very much interested in you as well, in whatever might come from knowing you." He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded once slowly, as though something that had been uncertain was now decided. He came back on Thursday, and the following Tuesday. The calls became a regular thing, 2 evenings a week, sometimes 3, and they talked about everything. About the ranch and the school and his memories of growing up on the Llano Estacado and her memories of Missouri and her mother and the brothers she had half-raised, and how it had felt to leave them and come west. They talked about the state of the cattle industry, and about the changes coming to the west, and about what they believed and what they doubted and what they hoped for. They talked about Clara once because he brought her up himself, carefully and honestly, explaining what she had been to him and what her loss had done, not as an apology or a warning, but as part of the truth of himself that he wanted Elsie to have. "She was the reason I went to socials," he said, "and for a long time I thought that meant I could never go again without her. But I think what it really meant was that I needed a reason. I needed something bigger than my own comfort with solitude." He looked at Elsie directly. "You became that reason." She held his gaze. "That is a very significant thing to say. I know, I mean it." "I know," she said softly. In February, he kissed her for the first time. It was not at a social, which might have been expected from the pattern of their story. It was at the schoolhouse, of all places, a Tuesday afternoon when she had stayed late to mark papers, and he had ridden by on his way back from town and seen the lamp still burning and stopped, because stopping had become the natural thing to do. He came in and they talked for half an hour about something that neither of them would afterward remember clearly, and then she stood to put on her coat because it was late and cold, and he helped her with it in that deliberate way of his, settling it on her shoulders, and when she turned around he was close enough that she could see the slight gold in his otherwise dark eyelashes, a thing she had not noticed before and which struck her as unexpectedly beautiful. He said her name, just that, Elsie. And then he kissed her, carefully and honestly, in the way that he did most things without performance or pretense, and she kissed him back, and it was the kind of kiss that does not announce itself dramatically but settles into a person quietly and stays there, warm and specific and undeniable. When they separated, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment did not require it. Then she said, "The February social is next Saturday." "I know," he said. "Are you coming?" "Obviously," he said, and there was something so simply sure in the way he said it that she laughed, and he smiled, a real full smile this time, the kind that changed his entire face and gave a glimpse of who he had been before 4 years of careful solitude, and who he was becoming again. The February social was different from the others in the particular quality of what Frederick and Elsie were to each other inside the hall. They arrived together, which was a statement, in a small town where everything is noticed. They danced together, without pretending it was just to be polite. And when they stood at the edge of the dancing floor, side by side, there was nothing provisional about the closeness between them. Mrs. Hadley watched from across the room with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. Mrs. Mercer watched with open happiness and no attempt whatsoever to conceal it. Robert Caldwell, who was a man of some perception, found Frederick near the cider table and said, "I'm glad you're back, Frederick." And Frederick understood that he was not talking about the social. "I am too," Frederick said, and meant it with a fullness he had not expected to feel again. Spring came to the Llano Estacado the way it always did, not gently but with a kind of determined sudden insistence, as though the land had had enough of winter and was not going to tolerate it for one more day. The grass greened along the creek beds first, and then the color spread outward in a way that made the whole country look as though something dormant was opening its eyes. Frederick's cattle grew fat on the new grass, and the ranch had a good calf season, and he rode his fences in the mornings with the particular satisfaction of a man whose work is going well, and whose life is also going well, which is a specific happiness that a ranching man knows when it arrives. He and Elsie had fallen into the comfortable and serious rhythm of people who are certain of each other. He came to supper at Mrs. Hadley's 2 evenings a week, and she came to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, riding out in the good spring weather on a horse borrowed from the livery, which made her feel slightly guilty because the livery horse was placid to the point of philosophical. Frederick offered to let her ride Ink one Sunday, and she said yes immediately, and then did extremely well on Ink, who was opinionated about many things but apparently approved of Elsie, a fact that Frederick noted with the particular pleasure of a man whose horse has endorsed his judgment. She loved the ranch. She had not expected to love it as specifically as she did, but there was something about the scale of it, the space and the silence, and the way the sky was so enormous out here away from town that it felt almost like an atmosphere all its own, that suited something in her. She would stand at the edge of the front yard and look west across the flat tableland and feel a kind of expansiveness in her chest that was not ambition and not dissatisfaction with what she had, but something more like wonder, the feeling of being small in a landscape that was vast and comprehending it as a gift rather than a threat. He watched her stand there and look west, and knew what she was feeling because he had been feeling it his whole life. In April, during a Sunday visit that had stretched past supper into the quiet evening hours, he found himself sitting with her on the porch steps in the cooling air, the dark prairie opening up around them and the first stars appearing, and he said without preamble, because he was not a man who led up to things he had decided on, "I want to ask you to marry me." She turned to look at him. "I want to do it properly," he continued, "which means asking your father first if it's possible to get his blessing, and I intend to write him a letter this week. But I wanted you to know first because you are the person who matters most in this decision, and it did not seem right to ask him before I had told you what I intended." He looked at her steadily. "So, I am telling you what I intend." The stars above them were coming in thick and quiet, and the night air had that clean, cold smell of spring in the high plains, and she sat beside this careful, deliberate man who had decided to love her and felt something in her chest that was composed of certainty and warmth and something that was, without question, joy. "Frederick," she said. "Yes." "When your letter comes back from my father, and he gives his blessing, which he will because he is a sensible man who makes good decisions," she said, "my answer will be yes." He exhaled. She had come to know his exhales as meaningful events, moments when the tension he carried without noticing released for a moment and showed her what was underneath it. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He wrote the letter to her father, Thomas Garrison of Independence, Missouri, that week. He wrote it with the same directness and honesty he brought to everything, explaining who he was and what he had, and what he intended for Elsie, and what he understood of her worth, not in the transactional language that such letters sometimes employed, but in the genuine language of a man who respected both the woman he was asking about and the man he was asking. He told Thomas Garrison that he was a rancher and a widower in the sense that he had lost a woman he was to have married, and that he had spent 4 years in a solitude he had mistaken for peace, until his daughter had entered Harrow Creek in October and rearranged the furniture of his interior life without apparently trying. Thomas Garrison's response came 3 weeks later, and it was 2 pages long, which was more than Frederick had expected. The first page covered Thomas's expectations for his daughter's happiness and well-being, and the specific qualities he would require in any man who wished to marry her. The second page said that based on the letter Frederick had sent, he appeared to meet those requirements, and that he had Thomas's blessing and his goodwill, and that he hoped Frederick understood what an extraordinary woman he was proposing to marry. Frederick read both pages twice. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his good coat, the one he wore to socials, and rode into town. He went to the schoolhouse at 3 o'clock when the students were released and stood outside the door while the children poured out in a stream of noise and energy, and Molly Dunbar stopped when she saw him and looked up with enormous eyes and said, "Mr. Talbot, are you here to see Miss Garrison?" "I am," he said. "Good," said Molly, with the solemnity of a child who has understood the situation completely, and ran after her classmates. Elsie came to the door and saw him and stopped. He was standing in the afternoon light with his hat in his hands, the ranch hat, not the social hat, which meant he had come directly from the ranch, which meant he had received the letter and not waited. "You got the letter," she said. "This morning," he said. "I came as soon as I could." She stepped out of the schoolhouse into the afternoon, and the light was the warm, particular gold of April in West Texas, and he looked at her and said, "Elsie Garrison, I love you. I did not expect to love anyone again in the way that I love you. I'm not entirely sure when it happened, except that it happened without any particular decision on my part, which is, I think, how real things happen. Your father has given his blessing, and I am asking you to be my wife." She stood in the schoolhouse doorway with the afternoon light on her face and thought of the woman who had arrived in Harrow Creek in October with 3 trunks and a canvas bag of books, and absolutely no expectation of finding this. And she thought of this man who had stood alone for 4 years and started coming to socials because of her, and was now standing in front of her asking for her future. "Yes," she said. "Frederick Talbot, yes." He took 2 steps forward, and she met him, and he held her properly for the first time, both arms around her, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and he held her with the careful, specific tenderness of a man who has learned to value what he holds. They were married in June, in the Harrow Creek church with the bell that never rang on time, and the bell was rung that day, 20 minutes late, by the minister's husband Herbert, who felt the occasion warranted it regardless of his timing. The community hall was opened afterward for the celebration, and there was food enough to feed twice the number of people present, and there was music all evening, and Frederick Talbot danced with his wife 4 times, which was 3 more times than he had ever danced at any social before he had reason to go. Mrs. Hadley cried, gracefully, and without embarrassment. Mrs. Mercer did not cry but looked like she very much wanted to, and was containing it by sheer force of personality. Molly Dunbar, attending with her parents, watched the dancing with an expression of profound satisfaction, as though she had understood from the beginning how this would end and was gratified to be proven right. Elsie moved out of the boarding house and to the ranch, which meant the 2 miles between the ranch and the school were now her daily route, and she had developed an accommodation with the livery horse about this commute, though she confessed she preferred Ink, who was available on the weekends. The schoolhouse continued and thrived, and Elsie continued and thrived within it, because it was who she was, and Frederick had understood from the beginning that it would remain who she was, and he would not have had it otherwise. The ranch in those first months of their marriage was a revelation to both of them, not in any dramatic sense, but in the ordinary, extraordinary sense of 2 people learning the specific shape of sharing a life. They were different in their rhythms. She was a morning talker and he was an evening one, and they learned to meet in the middle, at supper, where the day's accumulation of thought could be laid out and examined together. She reorganized the kitchen in the first week, and he said nothing, correctly understanding that the previous arrangement had been designed by no one and had simply accumulated over time. He repaired 3 pieces of furniture that had been slightly broken for years, suddenly motivated by the presence of someone who would benefit from them being fixed. They argued sometimes, because they were both people who had opinions and who expressed them without much hedging. And when they argued, it was directly and without the kind of resentment that happens when people say something other than what they mean. They always resolved it the same day, because neither of them was built for the kind of coldness that lets grievances extend beyond their natural length. They went to every social together, every single one. The harvest social of 1884, the Christmas social, the New Year, the February gathering, and every smaller community event in between. Elsie loved them as she always had, for the warmth and connection and the music and the dancing. Frederick went because she was there, and because he had rediscovered something he had closed off 4 years ago, that he was a man who actually liked people when he let himself, who found something real and good in the company of his community, who had simply needed someone to remind him that he was capable of it. One evening in the fall of their first year, walking home from a gathering at the church hall, the kind of small, informal evening that wasn't quite a social but was something like it, he said to her, "I am not certain I could have done this without you." "Which part?" she asked, walking close to him, her arm through his. "Any of it," he said. "The socials, the talking, he paused, the letting things matter again." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as they walked. "You did it," she said. "I just happened to be there." "That is a very generous interpretation," he said. "No," she said. "It's accurate. The capacity was there. You just needed a reason to use it again. People are like that. We need reasons." "You were a very good reason," he said, and said it simply. The way he said things he meant entirely. In the spring of 1885, Elsie discovered she was expecting, and told Frederick in the way she told him most important things, directly, in the evening, over supper, setting the spoon down beside her bowl and looking at him across the table. He went very still in the way he did when something had reached him at a significant depth. Then he got up from his side of the table and came around to hers and crouched beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Frederick," she said, "you have to breathe." "I'm breathing," he said, which was not entirely convincing, but then he did breathe, long and deliberate, and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling entirely well," she said. "I've been feeling well for 6 weeks, which is how long I have known." 6 weeks, he repeated. "I wanted to be certain before I told you," she said. "I'm certain." He pressed her hands to his lips, both of them together, and she felt the warmth of it and the meaning of it and the particular quality of his emotion, which was not performance but was very real and very large. Their son was born in November of 1885, delivered by the doctor who came from Abilene, because Harrow Creek did not yet have its own resident physician, a fact that Frederick had several complicated feelings about, particularly in the weeks preceding the birth, when the logistics of the situation occupied a significant portion of his thinking. The birth was hard and long, as many were in that era, and Frederick spent the hours of it in the adjacent room of the ranch house, in the particular anguish of a man who has no useful function and is aware of this, listening to sounds that terrified him and unable to do anything but exist in the fear and trust the competence of the doctor and the determination of his wife. Elsie was determined. This was not a surprise to anyone who knew her. When the doctor opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Talbot, and your wife is fine," Frederick sat down on the nearest chair with a heaviness that was not weakness, but was the specific physical expression of profound relief. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not crying, just resting in the fact that everything was all right. The boy was named Thomas Frederick Talbot, the first name for Elsie's father, who was to receive a very long letter about this development, and the second name for Frederick himself. which had been Elsie's choice, and which Frederick had resisted briefly on the grounds that it seemed excessive, and which Elsie had overruled on the grounds that it was not excessive at all, and that was final. Thomas Garrison of Missouri came to see his grandson in the spring, making the journey from Independence by train to Abilene, and then the remaining distance by stage, a journey that took several days and which he completed with the particular fortitude of a man in his 60s who has decided that seeing his daughter and her child is worth the inconvenience. He was a broad man with white hair and Elsie's direct brown eyes, and when Frederick met him off the stage, he looked at Frederick for a long moment and then shook his hand with the gravity of a man completing an assessment and finding it satisfactory. He stayed for 3 weeks. In that time, he helped Frederick repair the barn roof and played with his grandson with an unpretentious enthusiasm that was clearly where Elsie had inherited her own directness. And he sat with Frederick on the porch in the evenings after Elsie and the baby had gone to bed, and they talked like two men who understood each other's language because they were built on similar foundations. Careful, honest, proud in the productive sense rather than the defensive one. On his last evening before departing, Thomas Garrison said to Frederick, "She is happy. That is everything I needed to see." "I know," Frederick said. "I intend for her to remain so." "I believe you," Thomas said. They sat in the comfortable quiet of men who have said the necessary things and don't need to add more. The years that followed were the kind of years that a story like this deserves. They were not without difficulty, because life in West Texas in the 1880s was not without difficulty. The summer droughts that tested the grass and the cattle both, the winters that came too early sometimes and stayed too long, the market fluctuations that made the cattle business more uncertain than a person liked, and the ongoing negotiation of two lives shared in close quarters by two people who both had opinions about essentially everything. But they were genuinely good years, built on foundations that were solid because they had been laid carefully, by two people who knew the cost of loss and therefore understood the value of what they had. Frederick expanded the herd by 30 cattle by 1887, which was the year the ranch turned its best profit, and Elsie continued teaching school. And by that year she had 19 students and had trained up a young woman from town, Miss Agnes Bell, to assist her, which was its own small victory for the education of Harrow Creek. The school was becoming something real, with a proper library of 12 books and a set of maps on the wall and arithmetic primers that were in much better condition than the ones Elsie had negotiated for with Morris Hepp in October of 1883. Little Tom, as he was called to distinguish him from his grandfather in letters, was a child of considerable energy and opinion, which no one who knew either of his parents found particularly surprising. He had his mother's forthright brown eyes and his father's tendency toward careful observation, and by the time he was 4, he had already decided that horses were his primary interest in life, a preference his father did not discourage in the least. In 1888, Elsie told Frederick again across the supper table, setting the spoon down with the deliberate calm that he now recognized as her way of delivering news of consequence, that they were expecting again. He was better prepared this time, did not have to be reminded to breathe, but the tenderness with which he came around the table was no less for its repetition. Their daughter was born in March of 1889 and named Clara Me Talbot, the first name chosen by Frederick with a quietness that moved Elsie deeply when he suggested it, and the middle name for Elsie's grandmother. Naming their daughter Clara was an act of completion for Frederick. It was not forgetting and it was not erasure. It was the acknowledgement that the woman he had loved and lost had been real, and had mattered and would continue to matter in the way that formative things do, and that naming a new and beloved life for her was the truest tribute he could offer. Elsie had understood this immediately and completely, which was, she thought, the definition of knowing someone. Clara Me was a quieter child than her brother, with her father's still observant quality, and something in the set of her mouth that reminded Elsie of Frederick when he was working out a problem, which was to say she appeared both thoughtful and faintly amused. She had Frederick's tendency toward horses and Elsie's tendency toward books, and Mrs. Hadley, who by now was effectively the children's unofficial grandmother and had no intention of pretending otherwise, said that this combination was going to produce either a very interesting or a very complicated person, and that she intended to live long enough to find out which. Mrs. Hadley did live long enough. She attended every social with Frederick and Elsie for years, sitting at the edge of the dancing in her good chair that someone always remembered to bring for her, watching the Talbots dance together with an expression that she would have described as simple satisfaction, and which was, in truth, the profound satisfaction of someone who watched two people find each other and felt themselves to have been, in some small way, present and useful when it mattered. The community hall of Harrow Creek saw many seasons. The harvest socials and the Christmas celebrations and the New Year gatherings and the spring flings and all the smaller informal occasions in between. And at nearly every single one, year after year, there was Frederick Talbot, who had once been the man who never attended socials, who had spent 4 years building careful walls against the warmth that came with other people and could get in through the cracks and rearrange everything. He stood at every social with his wife, or he danced with her, or he helped Mrs. Mercer hang the garlands, or he moved tables at Robert Caldwell's direction, and the community hall that had once been the specific shape of a life he had not been able to bear knew him as one of its regulars, as reliably present as the fiddle music itself. In the fall of 1890, on the evening of the harvest social, Elsie stood for a moment near the door of the hall with Frederick before they went inside, looking at the warm glow of the lantern light through the windows, hearing the fiddle just starting up, and she thought of the woman who had arrived here 7 years ago with 3 trunks and a canvas bag of books and absolutely no plan beyond teaching school and doing it well. "What are you thinking?" Frederick asked, watching her. "About arriving here," she said. "7 years ago October. What about it?" "I was thinking that I came here for the school," she said, "and I found." She gestured at him at the hall, at the life they had built, in the broad, inclusive gesture that covers more than words do. All of this. He took her hand. His hand was calloused and warm and entirely familiar to her, the hand of a man who worked hard and held her carefully, and she laced her fingers through his with the ease of 7 years of practice. "The first time I went to a social," he said, "was for you. I did not go for the social." "I know," she said. "I have gone every time for you since," he said. "I know that too," she said, "but I believe by now you also go because you like it." He was quiet for a moment. The fiddle inside played the first notes of something recognizable and warm. "Both can be true," he said. "Both can be true," she agreed and squeezed his hand. They went inside together, into the warm light and the music and the company of people who had become, over 7 years, the texture of their lives in this small, determined town on the edge of the Llano Estacado. Tom was with the other children near the back table, already pulling at Frederick's sleeve within moments of their arrival, asking about something that required his father's immediate attention. Clara was in Mrs. Hadley's arms, which was where Clara preferred to be at social events, and Mrs. Hadley was demonstrating her own indifference to this preference by holding the child with obvious pleasure. Frederick dealt with Tom's pressing concern, which turned out to involve a question about a bet he had made with the Dunbar boy regarding the speed of their respective horses, and which Frederick handled with the measured response of a man who was not going to encourage gambling in a 5-year-old, but was also not going to deny that he had an opinion on which horse was faster. Elsie watched him and felt the specific warm pleasure of seeing someone she loved being entirely themselves in a setting that let them be so. Mrs. Mercer appeared at Elsie's elbow with a cup of cider and the expression of a woman who has been overseeing the social occasions of Harrow Creek for many years and intends to continue doing so for many more. "You look well, Elsie," she said. "I am well," Elsie said, and it was entirely true. 8 years ago, I would not have predicted that Frederick Talbot would become one of the mainstays of our gatherings, Mrs. Mercer said, watching him across the room as he and Tom appeared to be having a very serious discussion about horse speeds that involved some extremely committed hand gestures from Tom. "People surprise you," Elsie said. "Only when they're given the right reason," Mrs. Mercer said, which was an opinion and which was also, Elsie thought, completely accurate. The fiddle moved into a dance tune, and the floor filled up, and Frederick extracted himself from the horse debate and came to find Elsie and held out his hand. She set her cider down and took it and let him lead her onto the floor, and they danced the way people dance who have been dancing together for years, with the ease of familiarity and the warmth of people who have chosen each other repeatedly and deliberately and without reservation. He was a better dancer than when he had started. He had never become excellent at it, would not have described himself as excellent at it, but he was good enough, and more importantly, he was present in it, entirely there, not counting under his breath anymore, just dancing with his wife in the community hall of Harrow Creek with the fiddle music and the lantern light, and all the people they had come to know and love surrounding them. He held her hand and her waist and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was no distance in either of them, no careful walls, no deliberate separation from the warmth of what was happening. He was, she thought, looking at him in the lantern light of the harvest social of 1890, one of the most genuinely present people she had ever known. He had chosen to be present. He had chosen it against the pull of 4 years of careful absence, had chosen it because she was here and because she had made him feel the specific courage of choosing, and he had kept choosing it every social, every gathering, every ordinary and extraordinary evening of their life together. That was not a small thing. That was not a coincidence. That was the work of a man who understood what mattered and decided to show up for it every single time. "What are you thinking?" He asked the same question he often asked when she went quiet. "That you are a very good reason to come to socials," she said. He laughed, which still, after 7 years, had the quality of something rare and therefore precious, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the laugh of a man who has learned again to find things genuinely funny. "Is that so?" he said. "You started going," she said, "and that gave me someone to go with, and going with you is better than going without you." "I went because of you," he said. "I know," she said, "and now I go because of you. That seems like a reasonable arrangement." He pulled her slightly closer, and they kept dancing, and the fiddle played, and the room was full of warmth, and the smell of autumn and cedar boughs that someone had put in the corners. And outside, the big Texas sky was doing what it always did, being vast and indifferent and magnificent over the flat land and the little town, and the community hall with its light pressing out through the windows into the dark. Tom would grow up to take over the ranch from his father, a thing Frederick had begun planning for from the time Tom was old enough to ride Ink without wobbling, which happened younger than anyone had expected given that Ink had opinions about many things and first-time riders was one of them. Clara would read every book in the school library twice by the time she was 10 and request more, which Elsie arranged with the particular determination of a woman who had once negotiated the price of arithmetic primers with Morris Hepp and knew how to get what she was after. Mrs. Hadley would remain their nearest and dearest family friend until she passed peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1893, at a great age, and in the full knowledge that she had lived a full and useful life, and that the Talbot children were proof that things had worked out as they should. The room she had prepared for Frederick at Elsie's supper table, set without announcement or apology, was one of the small acts that had helped build something large and real, and Elsie thought of it every time she set her own table. The town of Harrow Creek continued and grew, as towns did in West Texas in those years, slowly and with the particular tenacity of things that have chosen a difficult place to exist and have decided the difficulty is worth it. The school grew. The community hall continued to host its socials. New families came and old ones expanded, and the rhythms of the place persisted. Harvest and winter and spring and summer, year after year, with all the variation that makes any life interesting and all the constancy that makes it a home. Frederick Talbot went to every social. He did not miss one after that first October night in 1883, when he had come through the door for the first time in 4 years with his hair cut and his boots polished, looking for something without quite knowing he was looking for it, and had found Elsie standing at the cider table with 2 pies, and a directness that had reached him somewhere behind the careful walls he had built to keep himself safe from exactly this kind of finding. He had been the cowboy who never attended socials. He had been that man for 4 years, and Harrow Creek had known it and respected it and waited, the way that good communities wait for the people in them who are not ready yet. And then Elsie Garrison had arrived in October of 1883 with 3 trunks and a canvas bag of books, and a small iron pot she claimed was essential and non-negotiable. And she had stood in Morris Hepp's general store and negotiated the price of arithmetic primers with the calm assurance of someone who knew what things were worth and was not going to pretend otherwise. And he had watched and said that it was well handled, and she had turned and looked at him, and everything, quietly and without particular drama, had begun. He went to every social after that. Every harvest celebration and Christmas gathering, and New Year dance and spring fling and small church fundraiser and informal community evening and everything in between, for as long as he and Elsie lived in Harrow Creek, which was for the rest of their lives. He went because she was there and the music was good, and the people were people he had decided to love, and because the community hall with its lantern light and its fiddle music was no longer the shape of a life he had lost, but the shape of the life he had found, and he was not going to stay outside of it for one more winter. He was the cowboy who had come back, and she was the reason, and neither of them needed anything more than that to be entirely, completely, and permanently home.